Some of the psych professionals I've worked with have a vernacular for this um, phenomenon, and they call it rotting with your rights on. So you've
Well, you're
exercised,
preserving your rights by claiming incompetence.
yes, and by fighting involuntary medication, and the result is you rot in prison. And here is where I'm bringing it back to the sentencing thing. In our case, the evidence was kind of on tape, so I'm not real concerned that there was no crime committed, but I am concerned that the basis for the crime was a mental illness. But the result is the same. He gets sentenced to prison. And actually, no, the result is worse because he's still in prison, and this was 2006. He's never been convicted of a crime, and he's been in prison for 16 years and may likely be in prison for the rest of his life. Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, this is Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona, helping us get set for sentencing today. The incomparable, the wonderful, the extraordinary attorney Donna Elm. Hi Donna, welcome. It's good to see you. I'm going to tell these folks all about it, all about you, but I just want to say hi and thank you for being here.
Certainly, I'm delighted.
So Donna and I go way back. This is another example of my privilege to have people in my inner circle that I've known for years that do really incredible work. And I'm so excited to have Donna on the podcast. So let me tell you about Donna Elm. Like I said, extraordinary longtime criminal defense attorney. She's an author. She's written many, many articles. She's written a book, The Defense Attorney's Guide to Witness Credibility. She's co-authored a chapter in a medical book on the subjects that we're going to talk about today, which is competency and involuntary medication and restoration, those issues. She was on the steering committee for President Obama's Clemency Project in 2014. She was appointed by Chief Justice John Roberts to the Criminal Rules Committee. I could go on and on and on, but Donna's last gig for years was serving as the federal defender for the Middle District of Florida. And before that, she was a colleague of mine. Her office was right next door at the federal defender's office here in Phoenix. So Donna and I handled cases together, and every once in a blue moon. And one in particular was one involving something called a cell hearing. And we'll talk about what that means. But essentially, it's a very big piece of litigation that you have to have when your client is found incompetent to stand trial or maybe face sentencing, but they can't be restored without administering antipsychotics, or really serious medication. And in the context of a cell hearing, it's usually the client or the client's attorney who's challenging the involuntarily, administering these medications. We're going to talk about all of this, and of course, I'm viewing it through the lens of sentencing because I think there are massive, massive implications here with the competency issues and the cell issues and what happens afterwards. So we're going to dig in and talk about all of it. But first, let's do story time. This Cell case, it's United States versus Cell, so it's a Supreme Court case, but all of these cases, they don't really always tell us this in law school, but there are actual real live human beings who are litigants in these cases, and they have real stories. And this one is about Dr. Charles Thomas Sell. So I'm going to throw it to you and tell me the story of Dr. Sell's journey through the morass of the legal system all the way up to the United States Supreme Court.
Well, Dr. Sell was a dentist, and they thought he was um, doing some fraud in terms of what he was doing with his practice. And so they began checking on him. The feds began checking on him. And after a while, they thought that he might be even putting out a hit on some of the agents. And they thought there might be something wrong with him. They ended up charging him. And then there was a superseding, as I recall. But Dr. Sell then was talking about all these conspiracies and things that sounded a little bit off reality. They decided that they needed to evaluate him for competency, and he was sent to Springfield, Missouri. The federal prisons have several medical centers where people are sent for various things. There's the three really big ones are in Butner, North Carolina, in Springfield, Missouri, and in Carswell, Texas, which is for women. The other two are for men. They sent him there, and then he went through a whole series of fighting about whether he was competent or not. Eventually, he was found to be incompetent, but they thought that they could restore his competency by giving him antipsychotic medication. Lee Lawless, who is the defender in Springfield, then started litigating, and he hired Dr. Cloninger from George Washington University Medical School.
Well,
And
actually,
Dr. Cloninger,
I have to correct you because it's my alma mater. It was Washington University in St. Louis.
oh, you're right.
So Dr. Cloninger, now, I can't remember if you actually said what the diagnosis is, but it becomes relevant in the big picture, which was delusional disorder persecutory type, if I recall, which means you're
Yeah.
being persecuted by some unknown conspiracy. I think what the Dr. Cloninger would say is that the delusional disorder is it's close, maybe a close. You tell me. Donna also has a. Why am I saying this? Give it to Donna. She's clinically trained psychologist before she was a lawyer. She had two careers, so that's why she's so good at this stuff, right? So tell me about delusional disorder.
Well, FYI, I'm not a psychologist. I was a therapist.
Therapist.
Um,
Okay, so
but
you screwed up WashU. I screwed up the therapist. We're even.
yeah, there we go.
Okay.
But delusional disorder is different from some of the other things like schizophrenia, bipolar, a lot of those things that seem to be much more, they have clear genetic histories, they have pretty clear certain things going on in the brain chemically that affect it. And delusional disorder is a belief system that is not really tied in with the different neurological and chemical things going on. There's probably some of it because we are all chemical animals, but it's very different from the others. And they're the most common ones is schizophrenia and bipolar sorts of things. By far the most common, and they don't have hallucinations. They have only delusions. There's a difference. Delusions, hallucinations is I'm seeing a pink elephant walk through my room. That's a hallucination because my pink elephant is not in my room. Delusions are more reality based, but it gets twisted. It is I was turned down by the government for these benefits that I thought I should get. And I start to believe, because I was turned down, but I start to believe that the government is out to get me and that they're checking my phone and that they're beaming things in to watch me and that they are tracking me all the time. And I start thinking that everybody who's following me anywhere is tracking me by the government. That is reality based. It could have been real, but it's not. It gets twisted into unreality and it sounds real at first. So the delusional disorders are harder to identify, but they're also much harder to treat. because it is reality based. I mean, and once you start prosecuting a guy with delusional disorder, where the government really is trying to get you, I mean,
Yeah, just
how
like
how are you
gasoline
ever
on the
going to
fire.
convince them that it's not?
Right,
And so it
right.
becomes very difficult to treat them. Whereas the guys with schizophrenia and bipolar can respond, not 100% by any means, but they can respond to some of the medications. Whereas delusional disorder, there's very little you can do medication wise.
And just to sort of bring it back to like 101 level, everything you just said is important in the context of what we call competency, because we're lawyers, we get a client and we have to defend the client who's charged with a serious crime, and they have to be able to assist they have to be able to understand all the legal proceedings, but they also have to be able to participate. They have to be able to assist counsel in the defense. And when it comes to delusional disorder, for the reasons you just stated, they have these super fixed beliefs about a government conspiracy, say, and then you're a lawyer. We're federal defenders. We're paid by the government to defend them, and we have to sit in a room and explain to them why there really is no conspiracy, and now they're going to be facing a prison sentence for a crime they committed, and all of a sudden we're just part of the deep
The
state
conspiracy.
conspiracy. And there's no way that a lawyer and a client can have a meaningful relationship under those circumstances. And so they're incompetent. Would this be a good time to talk about the case that we handled? And I do have the clip. So let me bring it back to the case that Donna and I worked with, because we had to litigate this issue with Sal, but here's the context in which we had to litigate it. So it was national news. I remember this, Donna, the night before we were assigned the case, because it was unfolding on CNN, which is our client had taken a courtroom hostage at the National Labor Relations Board here in Phoenix. And there was a huge standoff, and it was unfolding live on national TV, not just local TV. And I remember my father called me up, and he was watching it, and he goes, "Do you see what's happening here?" And I was like, "I sure do." And then the next day I had to call my father back and say, "Yeah, that'll be my case." So here we go. Let me pull up a clip, because what happens in these courtrooms is some don't have a court reporter to transcribe the proceedings. They have audio recording going on, so they can transcribe the court proceedings. So the audio recording was rolling the whole time our client was in the courtroom. So this was, what happened inside the courtroom.
Everyone up. Everyone up. Now! On the fucking floor. Anybody tries to come in and I'll blow their fucking heads off. Yeah, I could use a lawyer. I am the victim of a RICO Act violation. I am being denied equal protection under the law. I filed a RICO civil lawsuit in federal court. Everyone come out of this alive if I get my simple demands met. All I want is to surrender to the FBI with a civil rights attorney and media coverage. I've got such an open and shut case. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, we couldn't possibly lose in a courtroom. Only I can't get into one. I don't know if it's a government cover-up or the unions, I got fake phone books going to bogus addresses. I've flown to Washington. They denied me entrance into the U.S. Department of Justice. I try to go with a lawyer's office. Something follows me, gets there before me, takes over the office, I'm assuming with either fake or real badges, and then pretends to be the attorney, and then lies to me and gives me excuses on how I can't help. I was seeing an imposter doctor. Can you believe that shit? Tried to contact an uncle and some friends. Get to their house. Imposters. They're filtering my cable, filtering my television. I sat through fake court appearances with a fake judge. I don't know what power can do this shit. It's starting to look ugly, like there's no America.
That brings back a lot of memories. That was 2006 that happened.
Well, that shows real clearly, though, the delusional disorder because it was reality based, but it got way twisted.
Yeah. And so we got the case, and right off the bat, the magistrate judge says, we know there's competency issues. He was sent to Springfield for a competency evaluation. No big surprise there. They determined that he was not competent. By the way, this is total aside, but like I said, I'm seeing everything through the sentencing lens. Now, our client was in custody because he allegedly committed a dangerous violent act. And so, there's a danger element where someone can be incarcerated pre-trial. But there are situations in these competency things where they're not in custody. They're out on some kind of bond or bail or pretrial release. But when they have to be determined, go through this whole competency proceeding, they're usually taken into custody at that point and shipped halfway across the country to a place like Springfield. Isn't that right?
Yes, and in fact, I had a lady in Florida who was going through this very thing. Um, and she was out of custody and they allowed her to self-report. And so she flew off to Carswell. At first, she went down to Miami just for determination of competency, and then she was shipped to Carswell in Texas to be restored.
And I know lawyers have litigated this to, I think, little effect, but this is a sentencing issue in my mind because here you are, you haven't been convicted of a thing. You've had a judge say you're not a danger or a flight risk, so we're going to let you be free until you're convicted of a crime. And then, simply because you have possible mental health issues that might render you incompetent, you're in custody. And people don't know that. People need to understand that because there's an inherent unfairness built into this process. There should be no reason. I know I'm on my high horse, but there should be no reason why they can't go through this process with a out of custody, some kind of professional that could handle this in a way to keep them out of custody. But in the federal courts, they don't do that, and I wish they did.
And it's mandatory. Congress put it in the legislation that once found incompetent, you must be sent to one of the federal prison mental centers for
Yeah.
restoration to competency.
Second point on that, these medical centers, because you remember when John Hinckley gets convicted and he pleads insanity and he gets sentenced to a mental facility, and the public is kind of outraged because they think that that's a cushy thing, that's not really a punishment, and bleep blop bloop. And so I think the public has this misperception about what this means. Oh, well, if he's sent to a medical facility, it's like a nice place. Are the federal medical facilities any different than any other Bureau of Prisons facility in terms of the incarceration, the restrictive, conditions of confinement and that sort of thing?
Well, they are different. They are medical, and especially if you have cancer, diabetes, things like this that may really need medical attention, that'd be good. But the psychiatric ones, and they all have a psychiatric ward, a large one, and as a matter of fact, in BOP. The There is very little programming available. Prisons are much better than detention centers and jails because they have programming. You can work, there's recreation, you can be on a ball team, you can take classes, you can get your GED, you can get your college degree. You can be involved helping others. You've got church, all kinds of things you can do. Very little of that in the medical centers. And if you're there long term, that's really rough. It's just basically like being in a jail. There's some other problems with that, and that is that you're being housed with other people who are deemed incompetent and dangerous. And it's not unusual to be attacked. At the same time, you might run into somebody else who has the same belief system you have, and that will just feed on each other, and they will both get worse as opposed to getting better.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the
it's not a
security.
good situation.
It's not a good situation. It's oftentimes it's going to be much hard, I think, and I'm not just speculating here because we work pretty closely with someone like Maureen Baird, who's a former BOP warden and who can speak to this with great expertise, which is to say, the BOP is actually, if you don't have competency issues, is a pretty good security classification system. If you're a dangerous person, you're going to go to a high or USP. If you're in the middle, you go to a medium. If you're kind of low danger, you're going to go to a low, and then you could get a camp, which everybody calls the country club. It's still prison, but it's like you said, there's more programming, it's less restrictive. But in a medical facility situation, my understanding is it's anybody from anywhere. They don't have much of a security classification system in the medical center. So not only could I be housed with somebody who's got some kind of similar delusions to reinforce my beliefs, but I could be housed with someone who's very violent potentially, or there's just it's not a nice place to be. So I wanted to make sure that we disabuse that myth or that misconception that a medical center is some easy peasy place to be, because at least in the federal system it's not. That's fair to say.
It is a prison.
Yeah.
It is very definitely a prison. Locked doors, locked cells. It is not. It
Yeah.
isn't like a state hospital, even where they have some lockups.
Yeah.
It's not even that good.
Yeah. And again, nobody's convicted of anything at this point. There's a competency issue that has to be resolved. So now they're in prison resolving competency, having been convicted of nothing. So let's take it the next step. In our client's case and in Dr. Cell's case, which is the reason we have these cell hearings, they say, yes, you're incompetent. The only thing that's going to make you potentially competent to proceed with this trial, to let the government continue to prosecute you, is if we give you these medications, these antipsychotics. And the government doesn't necessarily have the unfettered right to just stick a needle in you and go. You do have some due process, or at least you do now, thanks to Dr. Cell. So maybe let's tell that story of what's Dr. Cell's issue, and how does it get resolved?
Dr. Sell was found to suffer from a delusional disorder, not as severe as George's, but certainly pretty bad. And so they said, we want to medicate him. Now, this is a doctor, and he knows a lot about medications, and he knows a lot about the problems with the medications, and he refused. They actually force medicated him at first, and it didn't seem to do much. The forced medication, when we talk about forced medication, this is ugly stuff. The guys come in riot suits. There'll be 4 or 5, usually men, sometimes a woman, because they have to be strong. They've got a person who is psychotic and who is refusing medication. They're going to have to medicate him. So they come in riot suits to protect themselves. And they will take him, they'll 4-point him, they'll pin him down to the bed, and they'll take a needle and inject, usually into his hip or his thigh, drugs. They want to do antipsychotics. Antipsychotics, back in the day when I was young and practicing, those were called tranks, short for tranquilizers. And that is what they do primarily. And they do work on schizophrenics and on bipolars to some degree. Some of them will not work at all. But they do work to some degree on those things. They do not work on delusional disorder. But they wanted to do it. And why they want to do it is because of the trank effect. It makes them much more manageable and agreeable, and they won't be fighting their case as much. And that means we have a client who can assist us. And so they want to have him just go along with what they're saying and be done with it so they can move along and get him prosecuted.
And by the way, these tranks, a lot of them have really serious side effects, right? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, there is. I can't remember the name of it. It's been so long.
It rhymes with tarditive
Well,
dyskinesia.
there's tarditive dyskinesia, and that is one of the most common, which is,
Are you so proud of me that I
you
remember
remembered
that?
it?
Yeah.
Yes. Tarditive dyskinesia is actually fairly common. And
It's like
even with one,
shaking. It's like
it is a movement, an
tremors.
involuntary movement. You can have your legs or your hands go. And there's been some effects now that they can reverse, but at the time they weren't reversing many. So you could have it permanent, your leg going like this, permanent the rest of your life. It used to be called the schizophrenic shuffle because their legs wouldn't move right. And tardive dyskinesia is a real bad one. It also, the second generations tend to do things with the blood sugar level. Our client had diabetes in the family. That meant he couldn't be on those because it can trigger diabetes. And
Yeah.
diabetes is a serious illness.
Yeah.
There's
Massive weight gain
another
can
one.
go along with that, right?
I'm sorry.
Massive weight gain can go along
Yes,
with that
weight gain
blood
goes
sugar.
along with it
Right.
as well. And if you're already overweight and being in a prison with COVID going on, where being overweight means,
No, yeah, you
yeah,
can't exercise, you're
so
locked down.
can't.
And by the way, pro tip, because you know I'm the video guy, I tell lawyers that if you're going through this and you lose and they're being force medicated, you want to get in there with a camera and a court order and a camera so you can visually track the progress of your client in terms of weight gain or demeanor or tremors, all the things, because there is, you speak to this, but in my experience, and you've done more cell hearings, but there is this sort of nonchalance that comes with the psychiatric profession to say, these are great, we use these, yeah, there are some side effects, but really no big deal, so judge, don't worry about it, just do it. And judges often listen to that, and I feel like it's a minimization in a lot of ways.
Well, there's another one where you can go into an episode where you get your temperature regulation goes crazy, and you don't have an infection, but you can go up to 110 and you die, and that's in a matter of hours. And so you need to watch people who are on these medications very closely so they don't do that. It's not real
Yeah.
common, but it's real deadly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so you have all of these concerns. And one of the concerns about it being a trank is how sedated they are,
Mhm.
because you're going to have your client, assuming that he even comes out of this, if he's tranked, if he's sedated, and you've got him there at trial and he's falling asleep, what is the jury going to think?
Yeah.
They're going to think he doesn't care. They're going to think that he thinks this is a joke and we're spending our time on it, and screw
Mhm.
him.
Mhm.
um, there's the problem that he may not be awake and lively enough to be able to engage his lawyers and say,
Yeah.
that didn't happen that way.
Yeah. And if maybe they're just, well, we don't have, it's not a great term, but we say they're sort of zombified. So what if it's a violent crime or a death penalty and they're just staring blankly off into space, and now they look dangerous and scary, and that's what the jury's silently judging for the whole 3 months of trial. So it's prejudicial in every imaginable way. All right, well, let's go back to Dr. Sell. So I think fair to say a couple of big reasons he says, I don't want these drugs. First of all, common reason we see in delusional disorder, person with delusional disorder doesn't think they have a problem. They think everybody else has the problem. So why on earth would they ever in a million years need to be drugged? So no. But then, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Sell, he was a dentist, but he was still, understood the severity of these drugs and the side effects of these drugs. And he said no. And when you're a prisoner in a federal prison facility and you say no to guards or medical staff, they don't really take kindly to it. And Dr. Sell had a whole story about the abuse that he suffered at the hands of the guards and staff. And, some people might have been quick to write this off as more delusions, but at the end of the day, the attorneys who litigated this were able to get the video footage from inside the facility, and Dr. Cloninger did an affidavit as to what he saw on that video footage. And although the video footage was sealed, we've never been able to get our hands on it because of so-called security reasons. And by the way, this was happening exactly the same time as the Abu Ghraib thing was happening in Iraq. So my conspiracy brain says, well, the federal government doesn't want Americans to see how we treat how similarly we treat some of our own citizens in our own detention facilities, and make a comparison to how we're treating those people over there. Another aside by me. But the point is, the affidavit leaked to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, so a lot of this was absolutely verified. So you want to hear that clip? Oh, by the way, Donna and I did a presentation about this way back when, and I had the good fortune to actually sit down with Dr. Cell and interview him about his experience. So this is him talking about the abuse he suffers.
Most of the time they just did things to purposely make my life miserable. They came in with a forced entrance with 6 goon people in the goon squad. They shackled me in a marten chain and in a black box around my wrist, and ankle shackles, and stripped my clothing off and injected me with a narcotic. They had me on this concrete bench for 19 hours, and when I woke up, they were shining lights in my eyes, and Dr. Demir was there yelling at me, just take the medication, just take the medication, and this will all be over and you'll be able to go into open population. But I still refused to take the medication. I was then locked in what we call the hole or the shoe or solitary confinement because I had called a nurse by her first name. And they were so outraged by that, claiming that that was so inappropriate. I had to spend 13 months in solitary confinement, and that made me somehow dangerous. They locked me in a cell with no heat, and I was in there in the middle of February with no blanket, no clothes, and it was freezing in there, and they kept me in there for 3 weeks until I was so weak I couldn't even get up to go to the bathroom. Dr. Wolfson was outside the slot of my solitary confinement cell screaming at me that I should take the medication, that I had wasted all this time of my life by not taking the medication. And in the morning, Officer Ramos proceeded to take a hose hooked up to the hot water faucet and hosed me for about 20 minutes with scalding hot water while I was screaming. And he called Nurse Goldenberg in to watch me in the shower. He said, "What do you think of your big man now? What do you think of your big man now?" He dragged me naked in front of the female personnel up the tier all the way to my cell and slammed my face against the steel bunk bar and said he was going to knock out all my teeth if I made one move.
Dr. Cell is kind of my hero because withstands all of this, and he's still saying no, no, no to the medication, and his lawyers are fighting and fighting and fighting, and eventually he ends up in the Supreme Court. And what happens?
In the Supreme Court, one of the things is you have a right to control. You had a right to control your own body.
Yeah, right.
Medical procedures that go on. Okay, we probably
Right.
don't want to go into that.
Oh my goodness. Well,
Yeah, but one has a right to control what medical procedures and medication one takes, unless one is a danger to self and others. And so there's that, as well as whether or not the medication would make him competent, which we didn't think it would, and neither did Dr. Cloninger. And the bad effects of the medication, and the Supreme Court looked at all of that, came out with a test of 4 factors and said you have to look at these before you force medication on a person who's been found incompetent. And so they could not force the medication on him. He stayed in there for a while, and eventually they gave up on their case. It took a long time, but they did give up on their case. And he got released, and Doug went to go visit him.
So 7 years he was incarcerated, pre-trial, not convicted of anything, fighting this forced medication. And it worked out, I mean, aside from the 7 years, he got out, he got a time served deal, which tells you the case wasn't strong or that serious. Although 7 years is a long time for a white collar case, it might not have been if he was threatening federal agents or whatever. But the point is, he got out immediately. They gave him a no contest plea, which is another, sorry, but this is a huge problem too, and I talk about it on other podcasts called coercive plea bargaining. Dr. Sell maintained his innocence all the way through this. But 7 years, the prosecutor goes, I got a plea for you. It'll get you home tomorrow. We'll get you out to a halfway house and home. You know, you're out of custody. All you got to do is sign on the dotted line. And he pled no contest, which is extremely rare in the federal courts. They rarely do that. So he didn't have to admit guilt. You're basically saying, well, there might be enough evidence to convict me. So sign on the dotted line, you go home. So he did 7 years and signed a coercive plea bargain, went home, had some supervised release like probation, and he's doing fine now as far as I know. But that is, let's backtrack to what you just said, which is the psychiatric professionals, the doctors at the BOP, the Bureau of Prisons, said, yes, you can give them these antipsychotics and there's a substantial probability that they'll work and they'll restore them to custody. And Dr. Cloninger, who knew better, said these drugs are not proven to work on this specific diagnosis, delusional disorder. They will not work. And flash forward to our case, and we got to interview some of the same players in the same case, and we had Dr. Cloninger was on, we hired him for our case too, and we had the good fortune of being able to depose these doctors and question them to say, all right, well, you say these would work on the delusional disorder, but, you know, medical is supposed to be science, so what's the science behind this? Where's the evidence? Where's the proof that you can use these drugs to treat that offense? And they just said, well, we use antipsychotics for all of it. It doesn't matter. But what they didn't bank on is the fact that Donna Elm was in the room questioning the doctors, and that Donna Elm knows this stuff, and that Donna Elm does her homework. And I was there, and I got to witness this interesting and I dare I say glorious moment during that questioning proceeding. So let's play that clip, shall we?
We have the textbook of clinical psychiatry.
There we go. Yeah, basically issues that you had discussed, you know, being relatively uncommon as treatment with antipsychotic medication has never been properly evaluated. Anecdotal evidence suggests a response is poor. Antipsychotics may reduce agitation, apprehensive, and anxiety that accompany the delusions, but leave the core delusion untouched.
Flash forward to you get a Cell hearing, and because of Dr. Cell, the Supreme Court set some standards about what the government must prove in this Cell hearing before the government can involuntarily medicate you. And we had that hearing, and our judge said, no, you can't do it. You haven't proven the cell factors, and you cannot you can't force medicate him. So tell the people what we won, Donna. Like what happens when you quote unquote win a Cell hearing and prevent the government from being able to stick a needle in your client's arm?
There's one really big picture thing as a lawyer you have to look at. And that is whether you should go for incompetency because you're about to hear about bad things that happen with incompetency, or insanity. And why this matters, because if you're found insane, you can be committed. If you're found criminally insane, you will be committed if you're dangerous. And so even if you're found not guilty by reason of insanity, you can get committed. Now, if you're incompetent, if you're found incompetent and can't be restored, you can be committed too. And so you, in either situation, you can be committed in the federal prison medical center the rest of your life, potentially, or until you no longer present a danger to self and others. Now, there's a difference. If you're a lawyer, you might want to look at it because incompetency has mandatory hearings. Mandatory hearings, I think it was every 6 months. You can look it up on the statute. Whereas the insanity doesn't happen nearly as often. And so the hearings are to see if you're still incompetent and should get out. Also, if you're incompetent, the government has the burden of proof to show that you're still incompetent. Whereas if you're insane, you have the burden of proof to show that you're sane. And both of those things work against a client. And so you may want competency over insanity. Just saying that.
Yes.
Once found incompetent, it's not a bed of roses. If they think you're a danger, you are committed. And you are committed like a mental health commitment to a state hospital. You're committed to the BOP's medical center. So you're in the prison medical center, potentially for life. George is still there. We just looked him up. And you can stay there for an awfully long time. And if you continue to seem to be a danger, you'll still be there.
Yes.
And it is only when you can show that you're not a danger to self or others that you could be released. And they're not going to take, if you're in BOP and you release somebody, and then they kill people, there goes your career. And so it's going to be, it's pretty clear the BOP isn't going to release people unless they really, truly think you're incapable of causing damage if you were involved in something violent. Now, I've had a couple people who were not involved in things who were violent, who did not have to go through that. One for about a year had to go through that, but that's all because she really wasn't involved in anything violent. But when you're involved in something violent like George, you could be in there basically until you're really incapacitated and on death's door.
Some of the psych professionals I've worked with have vernacular for this phenomenon, and they call it rotting with your rights on. So
well, you're preserving your rights by claiming incompetence.
Yes, and by fighting involuntary medication, and the result is you rot in prison. And so just to kind of put meat on the bones there, what happened in our case, and what happens generally in a case where there's violence or serious case, is they're not competent to proceed, so then they do another route, which is called 18 U.S.C. 4246, which is entitled hospitalization for a person due to suffering from a mental disease or defect. So what happens is the government will then have a new hearing, which ostensibly is like a trial, but I don't think it's anything like a trial. But what has to happen is there has to be a determination by clear and convincing evidence that the person's presently suffering, I'm reading right from the statute, that they're presently suffering from a mental disease or defect, as a result of which their release would create a substantial risk of bodily injury to another person or serious damage to property of another. So if they make that determination by clear and convincing evidence, then they get committed to the custody of the Attorney General. And it does say the Attorney General shall release that person to the appropriate official of the state in which the person is domiciled, and the state should assume responsibility for the custody, care, and treatment. That never happens, mostly because the state doesn't have the means or the desire to take these people, and they have to agree to take them. So they go to federal prison. And yes, it's a medical facility. We already talked about that. And here is where I'm bringing it back to the sentencing thing. In our case, the evidence was kind of on tape, so I'm not real concerned that there was no crime committed, but I am concerned that the basis for the crime was a mental illness. But the result is the same. He gets sentenced to prison. And actually, no, the result is worse because he's still in prison, and this was 2006. So he's been in prison for, what's the math on that? 16 years? Never been convicted of a crime, and he's been in prison for 16 years and may likely be in prison for the rest of his life.
I expect that's the case. They've still got him in a medical center. When you've been committed, sometimes on these things, they will have you in a non-medical center. And we've seen that happen sometimes when you're kind of cruising along okay. But he's still in a medical center, so things are bad.
And here's what got me thinking about this, Donna, and why I was so excited to do this episode with you, is after you so callously and brutally abandoned me at the Phoenix office to become the federal defender of the Middle District of Florida and left me helpless and alone, wallowing in my own ineptitude, I had another case, I had another cell hearing come up not too long after that. And in that situation, it was from the reservation. You know, we handle a lot of cases, federally serious crimes from the Indian reservations. And it was a child abuse, very, very serious child abuse case. And my client came to me with organic brain damage. So it wasn't a delusional, it wasn't schizophrenia, it wasn't something like that. It was, he just was not competent because of, I think he was born that way or through whatever, but I couldn't communicate with him. I couldn't ask him a question. Like, there was nothing that I could do to help him. And of course, when we have that, it's one of the first things we have to do is send them off for competency. And so he got sent off, found incompetent, not restorable, no medication. I think we litigated the cell hearing and again won, but I don't think it was even up for dispute because of the nature of his illness, that medication was never going to help him. So what happened? Went to prison. They did a 4246. He's found, to be a danger, and by clear and convincing evidence. And here's what really scares me. We don't do those. Once they get shipped off, so I'm in Phoenix, so they get shipped off. Those hearings, those 4246 hearings, occur in the jurisdiction where they're trying to civilly commit them, which in this case was Springfield. They're either going to be usually Springfield or Butner, North Carolina, like you said. So at that point, I'm not the lawyer in the case anymore. There's another lawyer who handles the 4246 commitment proceedings, and that's not a trial. There's no jury. The burden of proof is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's clear and convincing, and I honestly don't even know if the rules of evidence apply. So what I've got is a situation where I never even got to dig into the defense of the case before competency came up. And for all I know, in this case, not in our case, because it's recorded, the offense is on tape, but in this case I'm talking about, for all I know, this dude is innocent. I don't know, because I never got to defend him. And I hope that the lawyers back east got to defend them, and I assume they did, but even if they did, it was under relaxed standards of proof and evidence. And so this guy was basically shipped off to prison, and I don't even know that he was in a medical facility for this period of time, because I know he was in Minnesota, in Duluth, which I don't think is a medical, whatever. The guy did 15 years in prison before they finally gave him what's called conditional release, meaning, okay, well, we don't need you in prison anymore, which in itself is a mystery because he received no treatment. He couldn't be treated. I think they just got sick of housing him and sent him back to Arizona. So now he's in a halfway house down in the valley. So he's 4 hours away, four plus hours away from his home and his family, and he wants to go home. But he's stuck indefinitely in this limbo, this legal limbo, where he's never been committed of a crime. He served 15 years in prison, and he's still under the jurisdiction of the federal court and the federal probation for quite possibly the rest of his life. Am I glad he's not in prison anymore? Sure, but I don't even know what I can do for this gentleman to help him at this point. It's not even my case. The judge back in Springfield is the one that's going to have the final say in what happens. Any bright ideas? You handle post-conviction relief. Can we do a 2255 or something to challenge this? I mean, what's to be done?
Well, 2255 is an interesting idea.
Okay. Maybe that's our
But
next.
but the
Maybe that's our
problem
next
is,
project.
well, but the problem is with the 2255, in other words, a habeas. We're looking at a habeas corpus, which is let my people go. You don't have a crime, let my people go. And a 2255 technically isn't a habeas. 2255, that's 28 USC 2255, is kind of the federal habeas. What it's called is a motion to set aside the sentencing. But he wasn't sentenced. Technically, you can't go in under 2255.
Yeah.
You could try it as a writ, a habeas corpus writ, to say, there's no evidence he did this, let him go. But the problem that you will come against every time is, does he remain a danger? Is the court, is BOP, is whoever the judge is who's involved in this going to take the risk of letting him go if he remains a danger to other people? Because, you know, there goes your career. If you let someone go and they go kill people, rape people, it's really problematic for them politically. So will it happen? You know, do you have a good legal issue? Yes. Do we have, what we need is a good way to allow him to go back to the res and to be able to make sure he can't hurt people.
Which is to
We don't
say,
have it.
if he was hurting people in the first instance. But yeah.
But that's not even the issue, Doug, because you haven't even gotten him into court whether he's hurted people. It's whether he is a danger now to hurt people.
Yes, but in this case, the example that I'm giving, that is the basis for the finding that he's dangerous, that he hurt somebody, which is the case that he was never sentenced for. And in fact, once you go 42, 46, the government dismisses all the charges. So his whole criminal case was dismissed in favor of
They don't have
this.
to dismiss. By the way, they don't always dismiss.
Yes,
On George's case, it took several years for them to dismiss. I've got one case where they still won't dismiss.
And
She's
arguably,
done.
they could refile too, even if they do dismiss, right? Because they're usually dismissing it without prejudice. And
Well, yeah, but then you got a statute of limitations. That's why they won't dismiss on the bad ones.
do you think the statute runs when they're incompetent, or does that toll that statute?
I don't think it tells it.
Okay. All right. So, you know, fundamentally, I do believe this is, in a roundabout way, is a sentencing issue, and it's driving me crazy. I want to play one last clip of Dr. Sell, and this is him just kind of talking about, you know, where he is now and things he lost as a result of this process we call the criminal justice system here.
And I never set out on a crusade to become, you know, anti-administration of antipsychotic drugs. My field was never in mental health, but as I realized I was going to go to the Supreme Court, then I decided that I would take that responsibility on, and that I encouraged myself never to break. I don't interact with the courts and the justice system anymore. I just live a quiet life here in the country with my family. I lost not only the time, being away from my children growing up and my family. But I lost a very nice home in St. Louis. I lost a big dental practice, and I lost all the patients that depended on me to be their dentist. I really enjoyed doing dentistry.
I don't know if we can do like a big picture takeaway here. I understand when we have mental health issues and someone could be a danger that they have to be dealt with, but fundamentally it is an illness, and I don't believe that prison is the way that we should be dealing with an illness. I think the takeaway is we don't do a good job with mental health in the criminal justice system. Our answer for everything is jail, and I don't think that should be the answer when somebody's that seriously mentally ill. So what say you, Donna Elm?
I think the takeaway is that they try to get the state to take people who've been found incompetent. Generally, that means a state hospital. It does not mean a state prison. And the state hospitals are better at treatment by far. However, you and I practice here in Arizona, which, at one point was 53rd or 54th in the country behind Guam and Puerto Rico on funding for mental illness. They don't fund it here, and that's why they wouldn't take it. The takeaway is to fund the state mental hospitals so that people who are found incompetent can really get treatment and can be placed somewhere other than a federal prison situation. And then also we'll have people who are local who could supervise so that they could go home and report back in. It's called a conditional release. And, they do that for a while before they finally let them go. And that would be our best situation. Right now, they're just not funding. In some places, they don't fund mental health treatment well.
Yeah, and to compound that problem in my case example, if I hadn't already made that clear, because this was on the reservation, it's remote. A lot of these reservations, there's no mental health treatment, there's no outpatient treatment, there's not a lot of resources at all. So, if this person lived in Phoenix, it might not be so bad because he'd be close to home, close to his family, close to treatment, close to resources, and he'd be getting some. But he can't go home because that's a resource issue in and of itself, and obviously the subject of a whole other podcast. But it's just layers upon layers of dysfunction here. But yeah, resources would be good. Well, maybe whoever the future governor of the state of Arizona may be will hear this podcast and be so moved that they will move heaven and earth to sufficiently fund our state mental health facilities, and this problem will be over for our clients in Arizona. But don't hold your breath. Anyway, well, Donna, this was fun. It's always a pleasure spending time with you and seeing your smiling face, and I hope that we can hang out in person soon. And I'll be sending you the habeas case for you to begin litigating post-haste for my client, and keep me posted. Just kidding. Anything else we should talk about before we finish up, or do you think we covered it?
Oh, I think we covered it.
I think we did too, and you have a half hour before your next appointment. So I wanted to say thank you for giving me your time and your expertise, and not just today, but I'm saying like for the last 2 decades or so. I really admire you and the work that you do. So thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, by the way, world-class quilter. That I forgot to put that in the original bio. World-class quilter. I still have 2 beautiful quilts that Donna made for my sons when they were babies, and they are now 18 and 14. I have a college student and a high school student now. Can you believe that?
No, I can't.
Time's moving on. Anyway, be well. Take care of yourself. I'll talk with you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. Bye-bye. That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you. To you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.